Welcome to this webinar about grant and loan funding for tenement retrofit with Home Energy Scotland. This webinar is hosted by Under One Roof, Scotland's only charity dedicated to helping tenement owners and housing professionals with common repairs, maintenance and retrofit. Under One Roof has a website where you can find additional resources. My name is Chris Kerris and I'll be facilitating the webinar. I work for Loco Home Retrofit. We are a non-profit cooperative of homeowners based in Glasgow and providing an expert advice and support service for retrofit across central Scotland. Retrofit means upgrading existing homes with insulation, better ventilation and clean heating. It makes homes more comfortable, healthier and less costly to heat, while also moving Scotland towards its legal commitments on addressing climate change. In this webinar, we are joined by representatives from Home Energy Scotland, Claire, James and Stephen. And Home Energy Scotland is the government's advice service who will be helping us the advice service, and in today's webinar, Claire, Stephen and James will be helping us understand the funding available for retrofit with a focus on flats. So we're going to start with Stephen giving an overview, then we'll look at some specific measures and how they work out in terms of process and funding in tenements. During this webinar, attendees' cameras and mics are disabled, so please, if you have a question, put it into the Q&A panel, which you should see on your screen at any time, and we'll pick up those questions at the end. We are recording for YouTube, so you'll be able to watch this again or send the link to a friend, and we will send out the slides afterwards. So now I will put the slides on the screen. And hopefully I'm sharing the right screen. Thumbs up. And over to Stephen.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Chris, for introduction there, and thanks for inviting us along to share what support we can provide from Home Energy Scotland. For anybody that's not aware of Home Energy Scotland, as you can see from the next slide, Chris, as you can see from the map on the right-hand side there, Home Energy Scotland have a network of 5 advice centres covering Scotland. We're open from 8 AM to 8 PM Monday to Friday, and 9 AM to 5 PM on Saturdays. We're here to offer free advice and support to help make your home warmer, reduce your energy bills and contribute to a greener, more sustainable future. We're funded by Scottish Government and managed by Energy Saving Trust. We can be contacted on the number shown on the slides, which is free to call, or by email at the advice team at Home Energy Scotland. To find out more, you can also check out our website at homeenergyscotland.org. We cover a wide range of topics, some of which you can see on the slide here, but for the purpose of today's webinar, we'll be focusing on the financial support schemes. Pop it on, thank you. So, all personal advisors at Home Energy Scotland have completed extensive training and are qualified to provide energy advice. They will take your details and information about your home to tailor this advice specifically to you and your household, including the type and style of property you live in, the current levels of insulation, if known, and they will complete a home energy check to identify any areas that can be improved. They will also check to see if you qualify for any additional funded support that may be available through Scottish Government. As a minimum, they will advise on any current funding or financial support that homeowners can access to help with the cost of making energy efficiency improvements or the installation of renewable technologies. If you have more specific questions about energy efficiency or whether renewable technologies would be suitable for your home and lifestyle, we will arrange a call back from one of our the home's renewables advisors. You will then have a unique point of contact throughout your customer journey, providing advice and support, relevant reports, and information on those areas that you're interested in. As previous, this is entirely free and impartial. We're not associated with installers, manufacturers, or specific products, but can provide links and signposts to find accredited installers that may be required for certain improvements in technologies. Next slide, please. So, the funding options that are available, pop that on to the next one, thank you. We're going to cover three, two, just an overview and one in a bit more detail. So Warmer Homes Scotland is the first one, followed by Private Rented Sector Loan Scheme, and then the Home Energy Scotland Grant and Loan Scheme will cover in quite a bit of detail. So Warmer Homes Scotland is the Scottish Government's national fuel poverty programme. Its funded assistance is based around household eligibility criteria. The scheme provides grants for insulation, efficient heating and renewable technologies in homes of households who are struggling with the cost of high energy bills, making homes more affordable to heat. If a household is eligible for funded support, we will refer them to the managing agent, Warm Works. They will then manage the process, beginning with a survey of the property to provide a recommendation report and offer potential improvements that may be fully funded. In terms of the eligibility, it's very unique to each household. The advisors will give you in-depth, advice on the criteria and check to see if you are actually eligible for the scheme. And it's basically if anybody in the household is eligible. So it's very personal and very unique. And essentially that's dealt with, under the terms of data protection, etc. But if you are eligible, then they will look at the funded assistance first. For private rented properties, there is a separate scheme that's available for landlords. This is just a summary of the financial support available to landlords to help spread the cost of improving the energy efficiency of privately rented homes. This can be accessed through Home Energy Scotland, and as previous, any application will be subject to recommendations on a current energy performance certificate or potentially a specialist report. Landlords will be facing, the introduction of legislation to meet minimum standards for their private rented sectors in a few years' time. And as I say, there is the unique one-to-one support for landlords to help them actually achieve that standard. The main area that we want to focus on today is the Home Energy Scotland grant and loan scheme. So where a household may not qualify for funded support, advisors will take the customer through the Home Energy Scotland grant and loan scheme. As the title suggests, there is grant funding available for various energy efficiency improvements and renewable technologies. The grants are not means tested, not repaid. They can be applied for on their own, or with the option of an additional interest-free loan if the quoted costs are greater than the grant element. An application can be made through Home Energy Scotland for energy efficiency improvements recommended on a current energy performance certificate. And if you're considering any change to renewable heat technologies, our specialists will discuss the suitability and provide the relevant report to support any grant and loan application. So this is just a few of the topics that are involved that can be applied for under the loan scheme. This table gives a bit more of a breakdown. There's quite a lot on there, so I know the slide's not really clear, but it illustrates the current grant and loan values available through the Home Energy Scotland grant and loan scheme. For each of the measures that are listed on the left-hand side, there should be a recommendation on, excuse me, there should be a recommendation from an energy performance certificate. And if you're thinking about the renewables, it would be one of the specialist reports that we provide. So there's a maximum amount per grant funding, and that's generally up to about 75% of the quoted cost. If your quoted costs are higher than the grant element, there's then the additional support for any additional costs under the interest-free loan. And I know there's a wee slide further on that Chris is going to share, which gives you an idea of the sort of breakdown for individual improvements, etc. So I'm going to pass you on to Chris, and he's going to talk a wee bit more about key focus areas and retrofitting energy efficiencies, etc.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Thank you for the overview. And just to recap, so I think that there's essentially two parts to the grant and loan. There's up to £7,500 for energy efficiency measures, and then up to £7,500 on top for renewable measures like heat pumps. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And then the opportunity for some interest-free loans.
Yes.
Beyond that, yeah. Okay, so let's go and look at some specific examples, and we've got some slides here that go down through the measures that we'd be generally looking at for tenements as possibilities. And I generally say the best place to start is to look at lofts, loft insulation, ground floor insulation, and drafts. So we'll look at those first, and then we get into the more ambitious and often more challenging measures. So looking first at loft insulation. So the good guidance is to put 270 mil or 300 millimeters of insulation in the loft. That's about a foot of depth, and that means filling up between the ceiling joists, the roof joists, and then putting another layer in the other direction above the top. So it's important to put cables above the insulation so they don't overheat, and to maintain ventilation so that the loft space can remain dry. So the grant on this one from your table, Stephen, was that the grant will cover up to 75% of the cost or £1,500, whichever is the lesser. And there's the opportunity for £500 interest-free loan on top, if that is needed to cover the cost of the measures.
Yes.
And there is some scope there for covering enabling works, which can you just clarify what that might mean by enabling works here, Stephen?
So generally, if maybe sections of lofts are floored or there's items needing cleared out the loft, a contractor might be able to actually help with that as long as it's covered under their labour aspect. If their invoice is split between the materials, labour and the VAT, the VAT, subject to the maximum of the £2,000.
Right, okay. On this measure, there's no requirement attached to the grant for the contractor to have any particular accreditation, but there are others where we'll come to that later. And then there is the required evidence to be eligible for the grant or loan for a property is a recommendation on the energy performance certificate for loft insulation, or a recommendation on one of the Home Energy Scotland specialist reports. But I think those reports only come if you're getting renewables. That option is only available if you're getting a renewable measure.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So here's that in a bit more detail. So on the top right is it's like a screen grab from an energy performance certificate, which is showing a recommendation to increase loft insulation. And that's what we mean by the prerequisite evidence for suitability. And on the left, we've got the process. Could you just maybe take people through the process, Stephen?
So essentially, if you have got an existing energy performance certificate, you would contact Home Energy Scotland. We would look at it. We could help you review it so you understand it a wee bit better. And we can signpost to install websites where you can check for installers. The next step would really be to get your quotes. We recommend getting 3 so that you're testing the marketplace. Once you have your quotes in your EPC, we would then create the referral for your application online. Once that's completed, submitting your quote, etc., it's 10 working days to process it. We recommend not doing any work until that's been approved. Once it's approved, you will then get documentation to complete, and you have 9 months to carry out the work before submitting your final invoices to have the funds released to you. It's not like a conventional loan where the funds are released up front. Generally speaking, you would complete the work, pay the contractor, and then receive the funding back to yourself. As mentioned before, the grant doesn't get paid back. It would just be the loan amount if you've used that facility that gets paid back. One thing that we do find is that's very much a conversation with the contractor. They may be happy to carry out some work based on a deposit and then give you sort of 30-day payment terms once the work's completed, which then sort of dovetails with submitting your final invoices, a new EPC to show that it's been completed, and it's 10 days for them to process the final payment and pay you the funds.
Okay, so that's just worth reiterating perhaps. So after getting it installed, you're going to get a new EPC, submit the evidence, and then from submitting that evidence, it's 10 days to be paid out.
Yes.
But you need to watch out that the installer may have payment terms that require payment before you've received that money. So just, I guess that's the watch out. And another thing to re-emphasize perhaps is that you're not, it's to await approval. You need to have approval for the grant before you do the works. I think, is that right? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It can't be applied for retrospectively.
Cannot be, yeah, okay.
And any works that are started prior to a funding offer are not eligible for funding. So if any works have begun or been completed before the offer is issued, we wouldn't be able to issue the funding for that.
Okay, so let's move on to another measure. And please do put your questions in the Q&A panel as we go. There is a question there, maybe just to pick it up quickly. In rural areas, the grant limit increases to £9,000 for energy efficiency measures. I had kind of assumed that tenements are not in rural areas, but is there a way for people to check, to Callum's question there?
So generally when we create the referral for the customer for the grant and loan online application, there's a postcode search tool that identifies those areas that are classed as rural. and that automatically triggers the rural element of the grant and loan. So that actually gets added in automatically, you know, if the postcode qualifies, usually off gas grid, and, you know, poorer services, etc., you know, where it's mostly oil or gas. The other aspect of the rural uplift is where it might be a bit more difficult to engage with installers, like in the Highlands and Highlands. So it can be a bit more costly. So there's a higher element of grant there.
Yeah, and I guess a tenement can simply be a house split into flats, which you would find in rural areas, obviously. Yeah. So, yeah. Okay, so £9,000 in rural areas. Okay, moving on to another example. So there is support for flat roofs, and we do find that even in traditional tenements, or in room and roof. So a room and roof is where we have dormers, like a room built into the roof space, and there's probably a dormer windows. My general advice is for all kinds of roof insulation is avoid spray foam. There's no real need for it, and it can have a very adverse effect on your property valuation and your ability to get a mortgage or sell the property. So here the loan increases, or the grant rather increases to £3,000 and £1,000 loan. So it's double the support because this is a more complicated measure. And in this case, the grant requires the contractor to be Trustmark approved. Could you just explain what that means, Stephen? How do people find out about Trustmark contractors?
So again, we will provide a signpost to Trustmark's website where they can check for contractors that cover their area. And it's really to ensure that there's consumer redress and an element of insurance on any work that's carried out, so that we know that it's done to a certain standard. You know, so those contractors that have taken the opportunity to be Trustmark certified, we know that the materials and the methods that they're using are genuine, and sympathetic to the nature of the building, so that there's less likely any sort of backlash with maybe something goes wrong.
Okay. Okay, so after roofs, I always think suspended timber floors is the next thing to consider. If there's access from below, then these measures can be relatively affordable. If you need to lift floorboards because there isn't enough space under the floor for somebody to get in and put in installation, it can be quite, really quite expensive. It's really important to make sure ventilation is maintained under the floor so that any damp coming up from the ground or which is getting there from people breathing in the occupied space above, and that warm, moist air going down under the floor and then condensing. It's really important to maintain that ventilation so that moisture can be cleared out. If the insulation is going to cover up the floor vents, you can put in one of these periscopes, and good contractors will take care of those measures. The really good practice is to make sure the floor is airtight above the insulation, so moisture can't go down into the insulation. And ideally, there'll be a windproof membrane below the insulation to make sure that the ventilation under the floor isn't whipping or wicking heat out of that insulation. But the really important thing there is to pay attention to moisture. So grant here is 1,500, so it's like lofts, but here we do need a Trustmark contractor. Anything else to say about this one, Stephen?
No, I think that covers it. Is it again just the standards and the materials that are used to make sure it's a job where they maintain that airflow, underneath.
Right, and sorry, Claire, I should have brought you in as well. Anything to add?
No, nothing to add on that. I think that really covers it. Just to reiterate what Stephen says, just around the Trustmark, it's there because it is quite a difficult area to access. So any sort of repairs that might be needed can be quite expensive and quite disruptive. So that Trustmark accreditation is there because they have to abide by a consumer code to make sure that they can redress anything if there are any issues.
Okay, great, thank you. So moving on. Trying to move on. Okay, draft proofing. So loft floors and drafts. So good practice in terms of drafts generally is to seal up all uncontrolled drafts. So that means having functioning seals on window and door openings. So that's usually a rubber strip around the edge of the door where the moving part of the door meets the fixed door frame. Blocking chimneys, foaming up and taping between the window frame and the wall, sealing around penetration, so where pipes or cables enter the building from outside. The toilet waste pipes are often very bad for being very drafty around them. And then having airtight loft hatch and an airtight floor. So even just having tongue and groove flooring on top of bare floorboards can make a big difference to drafts. In terms of the Home Energy Scotland grant and loan, there is grant and loan where it's necessary to replace window and door seals only. So this is, am I right here, Claire and Stephen? So it's only where the EPC is saying that the seals on the windows and doors are no longer functioning or were never there in the first place.
Yeah, so typically what you would expect is when an assessor is carrying out the energy performance certificate, they would look at the glazing type, and if they record it as single glazed windows, wood frame, sash and case particularly, there'll be evidence or not of any draft proofing that's there. So they would actually put in that there's zero draft proofing for that style of window on most cases. The same round about the doors, whether it's to the external door or to the corridor as well. It's usually fairly evident if there's any measures already in place round about the letter boxes down the foot of the door. So they record zero draft proofing, which then pulls through on the methodology a recommendation for draft proofing. So that's where you would get that. Typically, if it's double glazed windows, there's an assumption that these are already draft proofed up to a certain extent. But again, there should be evidence of that, and it's a percentage split. So again, they look at all the openings. So they look at the total number of windows and the doors, and they work out the percentage that are draft proofed. So it needs to have a fairly high percentage that are not draft proofed to trigger the recommendation on the EPC.
Okay. Right. Now, an important thing I need to add in here is that there's a sort of a mantra that there should be no insulation without ventilation. As we add insulation to the property, we make the property more airtight, and at some level, the property will become so airtight that it's no longer getting enough ventilation to remove moisture from the property. That moisture will then, that humidity in the air will then condense on a cold surface. In this photo on the right, it's condensed on the uninsulated loft hatch. And that black mold is a serious health hazard because the spores that come from that mold can affect your health. They can trigger allergies. They can get into the lungs. And it's now subject of a new part of the Housing Act called AWAB's law, because it is a very serious issue. So if the airtightness, the general guidance in the building standards is that if the airtightness of the property is getting similar to a new build, then you should have mechanical ventilation. So, and the basic solution to this is to have continuous mechanical extract ventilation in kitchens and bathrooms, which is drawing air in through trickle vents in living rooms and bedrooms. And this is called DMEV, or distributed mechanical extract ventilation. In the middle picture, you can see what that looks like in a bathroom. And on the bottom right, you can see the vents. This one presumably here is from a kitchen, one is from a bathroom. Now, there's no funding here, because I think, is there anything to say about that, Claire or Stephen? Am I right in saying there's no funding, but I'm simply raising this as good practice?
Yeah, of course. So you're correct. Yeah, it's good practice. There is no specific funding for ventilation because it doesn't provide any carbon reduction, which is the purpose of the funding being available from Scottish Government. However, if there is ventilation that is required as part of the installation of a heating system, for example, and as part of the labour works and the works being carried out for the installation of a heating system includes them putting in some ventilation, then that would be included.
Oh, right. Okay, that's interesting. Thank you very much. Okay. Glazing. So good practice is make sure there's an airtight seal between the frame, the fixed part of the window and the wall. So foaming it up and taping it up. This is often a big failure. So even if people get new windows, they're still quite drafty. And if you're in a conservation area, it's important to check local planning guidance. And if you're in a listed building as well, you may need to submit a planning application or to conform to the local design guide. Now, the funding here is a loan, it's only loan, and it's only when replacing single glazing. And then, yeah, so the required evidence is a recommendation on the EPC for double glazing. Something I'm not clear on is, do you need to replace all of the windows to get the loan here?
Pretty much so. Again, there is that percentage split when you look at the methodology on an EPC, where the higher you get percentage of double glazing to single glazing, it loses the recommendation. We have had people who have maybe been looking at it for larger houses with loads of windows and maybe want to do it on a rolling project. So it's really case by case. They need to show that they've got that reduction in carbon. That's why it's only available for single glazed windows. I've seen some very poor double glazing, but because that still gives a degree of thermal performance, the carbon savings are a lot less and the energy savings on the fuel bills are a lot less. So that's why it's only single. And you can actually use the £8,000 for double glazing, triple glazing, or secondary glazing, which covers the listed building status and conservation status. When it comes to the secondary glazing, there's various different methods there. But within the reports that we can produce for customers, we can actually specify whether it's the magnetic polycarbonate panels, whether it's true secondary glazing where it's windows within the windows, whether it's secondary glazed units that are fitted within this existing sashing case. So we can go a lot further with the reports than what the methodology does on an EPC. But yes, it needs to be quite a high percentage to remove that recommendation for the post-install EPC for the loan.
Is there a way to predict how many windows you need to replace for the funding to be available?
I've not come across it. The only way that from memory is if we would then access, for example, Elmhurst, who are one of the accreditation bodies for assessors, when we model things on their the SAP methodology for EPCs, we can play about with that, but we don't go into that very often to see whether it would drop off the recommendations. Something we can do, but it takes a bit more time.
So what happens if people put in the windows, they haven't replaced them all, and it doesn't remove the recommendation?
We have had occasions where we've been able to see a clear improvement in the star rating for that improvement that we have been able to appeal through our Scottish Government policy leads in order to get the funding in those cases, but that is an exceptional case only. The recommendation coming off is the sort of main requirement, but we do have the ability to appeal on occasion. I have, however, seen it go the other way, and that's, we've had people who've replaced, maybe just the front windows of their property and not the back, and unfortunately it's not made enough difference on their EPC, and we've unfortunately not been able to provide the funding after the works have been completed. So we advise to proceed with caution.
One area that homeowners could look at is have that discussion with the assessor, particularly if they're getting a pre-install EPC done, to ask them to see if they can model it to make sure that if they're doing partial double glazing that it drops off of the recommendations, because they've got fuller access, and the methodology for EPCs changed last year, and there's a greater focus on windows for an assessor. They have to record every single window in the property, every frame type, every glazing type, and measure the windows as well. So there's a lot more detail goes into the scoring for windows on the new EPC methodology. I have to say, I've not seen it, I've not used it yet. We don't go into that detail because we're not producing the EPCs, but the assessors do now have a greater facility for modelling windows.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, moving on now to walls. So cavity walls. So some tenements will have cavity walls. So this is when we talk about a brick or concrete or block outer wall, a gap, and then another brick or concrete or block inner wall. And that cavity can be insulated where the wall is in good condition, it's not letting in rain, and the wall isn't exposed to highly exposed to wind-driven rain. Now, it is important to treat the whole wall, so that will mean properties below and above you, and sometimes properties adjacent to you. So, for example, this picture here of a 4 in a block is cavity wall, and you would need to certainly treat the two flats, above each other on one side, and because there's probably no separation in between the two sides of the 4 in a block, it might also be necessary. The insulation will basically fall out into the other side, so it may be necessary to insulate the other side as well. There is a grant and loan. No contractor requirement, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. Anything to say about this, Claire or Stephen?
No, I mean, again, when we're talking about contractors, there's no specific one such as Trustmark, as you would see for floors and room and roof, etc. Basically, what we do is we kind of signpost people to CIGA, the Cavity Insulation Guarantee Association. Now, they don't recommend installers, but they've got lists of members where you can see that someone's actually got that accreditation, and that's more for the guarantee for the work being done. Just as a quick aside, I'm actually in a typical pre-post-war 4 in a block. The local authority decided to do re-rendering and new roofs, and it already had retrofilled cavity wall. What they did was they cored the damp course brickwork on the outer leaf, and they removed all the old cavity insulation, which I was really pleased to see because I was watching it. I was off work at the time. Came out bone dry, but it was a glass-based insulation material which is no longer used. They then put the cores back in and then refilled it with the bonded polystyrene bead, which still allows the cavity to work as it should to allow the building to breathe, but gives you that thermal separation, for the reduced heat loss through the walls. So again, you can do top and bottom. Sometimes you can put a leaf in on the vertical if it's only two sides of, or the one side of the building that's been done. But yes, it's a straightforward process to do. I think it took them about an hour and a half to extract and about 2 hours to fill tops when they were doing it. It's a fairly quick method. Still to see the benefits on my energy bills, so it's not quite a full year.
Super, thank you. So we'll move on. Solid walls. So this is where I say to take extreme caution, because if you're in a traditional construction, say with sandstone, that wall's highly porous. It's absorbing water from the rain outside. It's also absorbing water from the moisture from inside, from people breathing, cooking, and washing. And there's timbers inside that wall. The floor joists, the window lintels are made out of timber, and they're inside the wall. So they're vulnerable to getting wet and rotting if moisture isn't managed well. Now, there is funding available for solid wall insulation. If you're applying it externally, it's really important to make sure there's no gaps. And that would mean removing all the services like downpipes, toilet waste pipes, electrical cables, satellite dishes, gas meters, and insulating and then putting those things back on. It's also important to make sure the roof extends over the top of the insulation so that rain can't get in at the top. So it's a very difficult measure to achieve in cooperation with neighbours, and that's why we rarely see it. There's also obviously aesthetic issues and heritage issues that will require planning applications. This picture in the middle is from the sort of the exemplar retrofit of a tenement in the south of Glasgow at Midry Road, which was an attempt to achieve the Passive House standard. And you can see that the standard has to be achieved. If you're insulating on the inside, this can also be quite risky, because there's a risk that you will make the wall colder. That's the point of adding insulation on the inside, and therefore there's a greater risk that moisture will condense inside the wall. So it's important to have a really robust moisture strategy to preserve the building in good condition for the long term. There is funding, as I said. It requires a Trustmark accredited contractor, and the evidence works the same way as other measures. Now, I think in some cases it will not be possible, or be very difficult for homeowners to add insulation internally to all parts of the wall. For example, if there's a bathroom or kitchen units against the wall, or simply the budget limits to how much of the wall can be insulated. So this, I think, star ratings come in here, like you're saying earlier on, Claire.
That's right.
How does this work?
Yeah, of course. So the amount of insulation currently there, we often find that homes that aren't insulated will have sort of that 1 or 2 star, and as that insulation gets put in, the star rating will increase. no matter how much it increases by, we will look at the pre-EPC and the post-EPC together and see that there is an improvement to evidence that the improvement that we've funded has in fact been installed. We understand it is quite complex with solid walls, that it's not a straightforward one-size-fits-all for every property. So that's a key thing that we can make exceptions on.
Okay.
One thing
Right.
to just kind of add to Chris, is if it's mid-terraced property,
Yeah.
you're only looking at the heat loss walls, so that would typically be the front and the back of the property, which then when you factor in the windows and door openings, it could reduce the amount of actual wall that's been insulated, which makes the impact a lot less, so therefore you're not seeing the same savings. You know, the reverse of that is if it's maybe a gable end property, where they've got a larger surface area that's solid wall, which would really lend itself to the internal wall insulation, therefore increasing the, or reducing the heat loss, etc. So it's very much case by case. The specialist advisors, certainly within Strathclyde Central, myself and Brian, have actually done the NOCN qualification for retrofitting for traditional built properties, and there's a lot of focus on retrofitting insulation that's sympathetic to the way the building is designed to work, to avoid any problems in the future like cold bridging, where two surfaces meet, etc. So we're quite up to date on the impact of improvements to make sure that we're advising that it's the right thing to do, or potentially the correct thing to do, or not, as the case may be.
Yeah, okay. Great, very interesting. I've got loads of questions, but we'll have to move on until we've got time for the attendees' questions, which is what we're really supposed to do. Okay, heating. A couple more slides on heating, and I think we're going to move to questions after that. So there is support to move to clean heating or to more energy efficient heating. So there's under the energy efficiency bracket, so the £7,500 in urban areas for energy efficiency measures, there's support to move to high heat retention storage heaters. So these are storage heaters that heat up overnight on cheap rate electricity, and can be an improvement on older style electric storage heaters or other kinds of heating. And then under the renewables bracket, so the separate £7,500 grant, you can get connection to a heat network or an air, water or ground source heat pump of certain kinds. And again, but that's up to 100% of the cost. And here the loan increases to £7,500. Yeah, I'm not sure where do you see people getting high heat retention electric storage heaters?
Typically, going back to the fact that the rental properties are going to be tasked with reaching a minimum standard, where older buildings that maybe had old storage heaters, electricians would tend to recommend take them out, put decent panel heaters in. The rating will go down simply because you're reverting to standard rate electricity. The EPC is still a cost rated model, so it factors in the main heat and fuel tariff. So the high heat retention storage heaters combat that on two levels. One, because you've got the option of the overnight rate, but more importantly, the controls on these types of heaters these days are far superior. A lot more ability to program them, to charge them, and maintain your cost to charge them up, and then program them for delivering the heat with thermostats for controlling them. As you can see from the diagram or the picture there, the vents are at the bottom, which just seemed logical. Previously, they would be about a third of the way up the wall, charging out the heat. So usually all electric properties, maybe panel heaters and or old storage heaters, it's a good option to improve efficiency and reduce your fuel bills.
Yep. And within the funding scheme, we tend to see applications for high heat retention storage heaters from flats in particular, where there's no space for things to support heat pumps. So where a heat pump isn't suitable for the property for whatever reason, it tends to be high heat retention storage heaters that are taken as the alternative.
Yeah, great, thank you. Maybe one more thing to say about this is that, electric panels or storage heaters will generate 1 unit of heat for 1 unit of electricity. The advantage of storage heat is that you're using off-peak, cheaper electricity to get a bit of a cost advantage. But with a heat pump, if you can get one installed, you're getting at least 3, sometimes 4 units of heat for 1 unit of electricity. And you can even use off-peak for the hot water as well. So this, if you can get a heat pump, your bills will be lower. Okay, so and one more slide on this about air source heat pumps. So this table is summarizing some of the available kinds of heat pump. So the first 3 are air to water heat pumps. So this first one is an outdoor located air to water. This is what people usually mean when they say air source heat pump, but there are other kinds of air source heat pump. So the heat is coming from the air outside. It's being transferred to water for water-filled radiators inside the property. The unit is located outside. It would typically supply hot water. You can get MCS certified heat pumps. It's very, that is the main thing that MCS would certify, which is a requirement for funding. So, and it is funded by Home Energy Scotland. It's suitable for flats where there's existing radiators and you can find somewhere to locate the heat pump outside. Then there's indoor located air to water heat pumps. So the same kind of system, but the air is being drawn through big ducts. So 4 200 mm ducts in the wall to bring in the air and then exhaust the chilled air back out at the top. So these are MCS certified, they're air to water, I believe are funded. And then we get to exhaust air heat pump, which where again it's air to water, but in this case it's using ventilation extract air. So it's using waste, stale, warm air as the source of heat. Now these work in only very particular circumstances. They're very suited to properties with very low heat demand, so well insulated, and usually with high occupancy. So there's quite a lot of people in the property. So there is a need for ventilation. These are not funded by Home Energy Scotland. And then there's air to air, which is a lot less expensive as a system, and it is the most common form of heat pump in Britain and Europe, but mostly in commercial environments like shops. It's not so common in domestic properties other than for cooling in summer, where properties are vulnerable to overheating in summer. And they are relatively cheap. So we're talking maybe £4,000 or £5,000 rather than £15,000-16,000 for an air to water heat pump, but not MCS certified and not funded. Hopefully I've captured that well. Please correct me if I got anything wrong there. I'll move on then. And I've just got a slide here just with some thoughts about how to get good outcomes, because there are lots of horror stories around poorly insulated installation or poorly installed heating systems. And some comments I've got there, and please add to it, Claire, Stephen, is about, we would say at Local Home, take a holistic approach to achieving your goals. Don't just respond to whatever ad you're seeing about whatever nice ad you're seeing on social media or wherever. Take a holistic approach and think about what are you trying to achieve and what's a way to reach that. You can use an independent expert advisor who can guide you, provide additional support and advice beyond what you'd get from the automated recommendations on an EPC, or and as well as getting the advice from Home Energy Scotland. Use Trustmark accredited installers. So if people are Trustmark, it means they've achieved some level of evidence in terms of their training and their documentation. I would say you should go further and make sure you're selecting good Trustmark accredited installers, and retrofit intermediaries like Local Home can help you find good contractors and compare quotes. Make sure you're understanding what you're paying for and whether you're getting good value, and avoid sales scams, which you'll find quite frequently on social media, like window recycling scheme or a Scottish solar incentive. These are not real funding schemes. The only place to get public funding is from Home Energy Scotland. And that's because the ECOS grant scheme is gone. It basically finishes next week. And so the only way to get public funding is from Home Energy Scotland, and they'll tell you if there's even a local scheme from your local council. So like area-based schemes, I think, Claire, if the local authority, your council is running an area-based scheme, you would be able to signpost people to those schemes as well. Is that right? Hope I got that right.
Yep. We do signpost them if there's local authority that's doing improvements, or if there's eco funding that's ongoing. It's very difficult for us to pinpoint because the schemes come and go very quickly as the installers use up the funding that they've drawn down from the energy companies. What I would also say, Chris, is we when you mention a holistic approach, we tend to reference fabric first, which is a bit of a misnomer, but I know that from previous engagement with Under One Roof, they provide a wealth of information on building maintenance, which is usually a good starting point before you start thinking about lofts and wall insulation, etc., if there's any damage to the externals. So there's a lot of information that Under One Roof can provide for fabric improvements or maintenance before you start doing spending money on energy efficiencies, etc.
Absolutely excellent. Yeah, very good to point that out. Right,
I'll come in on that point as well,
Yeah.
Chris, if you don't mind. Just around, there are some terms and conditions within the Home Energy Scotland grant and loan around addressing particularly loft and wall insulation if you are installing a heating system and it's a condition of the loan. Wanted to highlight the fact that if the EPC shows that the property is a flat, and if you've not been able to speak with all your neighbours to ask them whether they want to split the cost if they're in one of those traditional 4 in a blocks, then we can make an exception to that rule to be able to still fund a heating system for properties that are in flats, because we know that that's a much more difficult thing to address.
Great, thank you. Right, so we've got 10 minutes or so left for questions. So going back to that question about postcodes, I think James has clarified in the chat that there is a tool where people can find out whether their postcode fits into the rural uplift area. I've lost my track of it. Is that anything to add on that, Claire? I'm not sure if I followed that correctly. Claire or Stephen?
Yeah, that's right. You can go to Home Energy Scotland and they'll be able to put your postcode in. If you wanted to check directly, the rules specifically are that you have to be in urban rural classification 6 and also off gas, or urban rural classification 7 and 8, or an island. So those are the areas that are eligible for rural uplift.
Right. Thank you. But I think the question there was, is there a place where someone can just look it up? No, you have to phone.
Yeah.
You have to phone up. Okay. Okay. In tenements, roofs and external walls are common areas. If I want a grant to install insulation in these areas, do I need to do a joint application with all my neighbours? Okay, maybe
not necessarily. If you're talking about a top floor flat with access to the loft or the communal stairwell, usually the reason it's there, usually the loft space is open across all the properties. That's not to say that you can't just insulate above your property, because that's all that the assessor would be looking at in terms of what insulation is there. But it does make sense to speak to your neighbours and see whether they would then obviously be able to access the grant loan scheme as well, and have the work all done at the one time. It might reduce the cost a little bit. That's just an aside. But typically you can just do your own loft space. We see that more for private landlords who just want to improve the loft insulation.
Yeah, so I guess there's a point about, in terms of lofts, you might need the agreement of your neighbours to be making a change in the loft space, but you can apply for the grant on your own.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. In practical terms, each application would be individual for each property, and each property would need to have the recommendation on their EPC in order to gain the funding. They would also need separate invoices from the installer as well, one for each property, just so that we can do our due diligence when we're processing it. But we have processed many that have been like that in the past.
Okay, great. Does Home Energy Scotland fund the removal of failed cavity wall insulation, or fund the replacement of new EPS or polystyrene beads if the customer pays privately for a removal?
So essentially what they would probably need to do is have it extracted first, then have the EPC done to reflect that there's no cavity insulation there, and then apply for the grant and loan funding to reinstall it. So a wee bit more to the process and a bit more thinking to look at that. I'm assuming there that maybe the existing EPC records that there's cavity wall insulation there, because it doesn't say whether it's fit for purpose or if it's failed.
Yeah.
So it's an installer that would need to identify that by checking the cavity themselves.
Okay. Is there any? Do you need any specific certification for installation of high heat retention storage heaters on the HES funding?
Qualified electricians. That's all we recommend.
That's the recommendation. There's no particular thing. Okay, great. Well, that's, I think, all the questions we've got. Unless Rebecca, you want to shout out any other questions? Oh, another one coming. Right. Any other questions, Rebecca? As far as you know.
No, there's nothing else in the chat or the Q&A apart from Callum's pending one. If a loft has a recommendation for insulation, can we remove old existing insulation as part of the quote? I.e. the old loose fill
So again, that would
or
be part
wet
of the
insulation.
sort of question about enabling, if the
Yeah.
contractor was including that in their labour costs and it came within the overall grant and loan value. I mean, it has to be said that depending on the size of the loft and the actual cost involved, you're not actually limited to £2,000. There's the £1,500 grant, there's the additional £500, but there could also be customer contribution if you're using particular materials for insulation. So sometimes it really depends on the quality of the install and what's required there.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I think that is all the questions. And Callum says, ideal, thank you.
Right. So I'll just put on my last couple of slides. Sorry, I got kicked out for a second there. Sorry, 1 second. Okay, so thank you very much for those questions. So just to say, I'll do one little plug for Loco Home. So we are a cooperative of households, a non-profit advisor and intermediary serving the Central Belt, providing whole home plans, whole tenement plans, and advice and support for heating upgrades, boiler optimizations. And we have a vetted network of installers who meet or exceed the requirements of Trustmark and other standards. So please do get in touch with us. If any of this, if you're interested in pursuing this with some further support, in addition to the support available from Home Energy Scotland. Please do provide some feedback to Under One Roof. Under One Roof is a charity. This work today has been grant funded and they need feedback to support their work ongoing. Please use the QR code and we'll send out the link as well. And a reminder, as Stephen was saying earlier on, there's excellent resources on the Under One Roof website. So please check it out at underoneroof.scot. And you can also send in your questions about cooperation on maintenance repairs or retrofit to info@underoneroof.scot. Great. Well, thank you very much. And there we go. So that is the end of the webinar. Thanks very much.
Brilliant, thank you, everyone.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks. Bye just now.